But yeah, I guess I shall get on with the first story for tonight, which is A Night on the Moor by R.Murray Gilchrist. The sun had set in a dull red glow, and twilight fell with odd swiftness. Although the sparse thorns on the moor, all inclining from west to east in obedience to the prevalent winds, were scarce tinged with the bright hues of autumn, a few thin flakes of snow were falling gently. Lindsay Wormsworth, who had rented the shooting from Squire Greenleaf, buttoned his coat and, finally discharging his gun, prepared to return to the lodge. That afternoon, since his friends had passed on to other places and a new party was not to arrive until the following day, he had been obliged to tramp alone. Barton, the old keeper, had complained mysteriously of rheumatism in his shaky knees, and, after begging him on no account to be benighted, had tottered homeward when they reached the confines of the park. The bag, which was slung over Wormsworth's shoulder, was heavy with slaughtered grouse. A brace of woodcock, too rare a prize to be carried in such plebeian company, bulged in his right-hand pocket. This great stretch of tableland, in the very heart of the Peak country, was covered chiefly with ling and sphagnum. Here and there, round beds of rushes, wet and blood-coloured, disclosed the existence of treacherous marsh. Wormsworth, after passing a druid circle, found an ancient bridle path of hollowed slabs, which he had never seen before, and surmising that it passed in the direction of his resting place, he began to hurry, thankful to be relieved from the necessity of carefully picking his way over the sodden ground. As far as he could understand, he had more than 3 miles to cover before reaching comfortable shelter, but being young and hot-blooded, he felt no tremors, and lifting a powerful voice in a popular hunting song, he shaped the rhythm to the muffled sound of his footsteps. After a while, however, so intense grew the blackness and so heavy the snowfall that he stopped short in his elegy of John Peel, and with a sudden uneasiness drew out his compass, struck a match, and strove to discover if he were on the right track. A gust blew out the light immediately, but not before he had seen that the needle had fallen from its pivot. Without further delay he continued to proceed, trusting to a keen sense of locality which he had never known to fail. After he had proceeded for at least an hour, and now not yet reached the sloping clough at whose lower end stood the lodge, he found that he had left the path and was straying knee-deep in heather, whose branches were so tough that no firing could have been done for years. The snow was still falling, and the wind rose in low soughs. He began, unwillingly, to realize that he was lost, and, in spite of Barton's deprecations, in all probability must remain on the moor until daybreak. Fortunately, just as he had resigned hope of finding any shelter, his outstretched left hand touched a stout wooden door, and after a brief struggle with the latch he entered a shepherd's hut, mud-walled and thatched with turves. On striking another match, he discovered, to his great relief, that the place was waterproof, and that, in readiness for the winter, a huge bundle of fir boughs lay in the corner, beside a great stone, above which rose a narrow chimney. To set light to a few twigs was the work of a moment. Soon a brave fire was crackling lustily. A bed of dried bracken was spread on trestled boards. He sat down, drew out his pipe, and thanked the gods for a harbour of refuge. Excuse my stomach noises. The resinous sap of fir wood diffused a fragrant odour that overpowered the fumes of the tobacco, and the flames cast dancing shadows on the dark brown walls. Ere long, the heat of the place made him drowsy. He lay full length on the bracken, and with his face turned towards the glow, fell fast asleep. He was awakened very soon, however, by the distant barking of a dog, and in the belief that someone was searching for him, he sprang to his feet and threw open the door. Outside the blackness was denser than ever. The firelight struck against a barrier of mist. The downfall had ceased. There was no longer any moaning of the wind. Half convinced that the noise had existed only in his own fancy, he placed his fingers again on the latch, when it was repeated, and peering in the direction whence it came, he saw, nearby, the greenish light of a lantern. In another moment a young woman glided forward and stood, like a gorgeous shadow, on the threshold. The lantern swung from one hand, the other held a gauzy handkerchief slipped through the collar of a timid white fawn. In the background crouched a huge old mastiff whose eyes gleamed sullenly. The lady's beauty, coupled with the quaintness of her attire, numbed Wormsworth's faculty of speech. He did naught but gaze stupidly on the strange picture. Her skin was very fair, touched with a faint pink in the cheeks. Her eyes were deep blue and lustrous, her mouth archly curved. On either temple hung a cluster of black curls, connected across the smooth forehead with a jewelled trellis work. Above rose a turban of gold gauze, one fringed end of which fell to her neck, surmounted with the plumage of a bird of paradise. Her gown, of carmine velvet, was not of the present fashion. The bodice, tight to the waist and heart-shaped at the bosom, the skirt swelled over a great hoop. This was nearly covered with a long white satin-lined mantle of beet red with vast sleeves. A collar and cape of sable lay slightly on her polished shoulders, unclasped so that a brilliant necklace was visible. There were no signs of travel in her costume. Her bronze sandals were not even damped with the snow. "La!" she cried in dismay. "I had hoped to find Shepherd Nor here, to beg him to shelter my poor fawn. Marlowe turned her out on the poor, hoping, perchance, she'd lie before daybreak. He hates all gifts that others offer me. I took Lightfoot and went a-seeking her. Not a long task. The wretch lay under my chamber window." Wormsworth was still tongue-tied. The stranger shrugged and pouted. "Lord, what an outlandish costume!" she cried. "Prithee, good gentleman, art come from the shores of Greenland?" He flushed and found his speech. "No, madam, but from Calton Lodge," he said. "I am belated here, after a day's shooting. I have kindled a fire to rest by till morning." "Oh, monsieur!" she exclaimed, with a merry laugh. "No Englishman spoke with such an accent. But you are wrong, sir, in meditating a night spent here. My own house in Offerton lies not half a mile away, and Marlowe, my husband, shall play host at my bidding. No demur, I entreat. Come with me now. We'll leave Crystalla, the fawn, in your stead, and you shall bring life to a deadly dull place." There was something so fascinating in the beauty's aspect that Wormsworth had no thought of declining. The mode of her garments perplexed him somewhat. Never before had he seen a woman gowned so strangely. Yet there was no doubt that what she wore became her vastly. In some odd way she reminded him of an 18th century painting of a belle of the Georgian court. A brief glance at her hands showed him that they were daintily kept and extremely small. She displayed a fine ring upon each finger. "I shall be very grateful," he replied. "I had no knowledge of a house so near the lodge." "Why," she said, "if 'tis Calton Lodge you speak of, you are full 7 miles from it. I'm taking you to Offerton Hall in Barley Clough. Surely you've heard of the place. My husband, Stephen Marlowe, the last of the Marlowes, compels me to live in this barren peakland." "Forgive me," said Wormsworth, "but I'm almost a stranger here. I know naught of this country. This season I rented Squire Greenleaf shooting for a whim." "Heavens!" interrupted the lady. "Will Greenleaf shooting? And I saw him but yesterday, and he said not a word of it. But he was ever a sly, cunning lad. His eyes tell me that. When he seems to be looking at the wall, Lord, he's noting everything that passes. Now, sir, I beg of you, let us go on to Offerton. I'm warm by nature, but this night's enow to strike one dead." The white fawn, it was evidently accustomed to the shelter of a roof, lay before the hearth. Wormsworth closed the door, and the lady who refused to relinquish the lantern walked a few paces in front, with the dog at her side. "I must tell you that Steve is a man of odd fancies," she observed. "As jealous a rogue as was e'er begotten, he cannot bear those whom he loves to give word or look to another. But you, an outlandish stranger, benighted, he won't fail to offer you a hearty welcome." There was a shade of doubt in her voice. She paused, as if reflection told her that she had been better advised to leave Wandsworth in the shepherd's hut. She sighed lightly because of her fleeting cowardice, then hurried on again. "Tonight he had a whimsy for turning my Crystalla loose. I doted on her too much," said he, "and 'twas because my lord, the Earl of Newborough, bred her. If I had not unchained Lightfoot and donned my cloak and ran out, the poor angel will have frozen stark. I'll send her back to my lord tomorrow, if I can find in my heart to part with her. Yet Steve's a good soul, though there's black blood in his veins. Sometimes, I protest, he makes me tremble like an aspen leaf. He was in one of his wildest humours an hour ago, but I ne'er show that I'm daunted, and I gave him word for word, told him naught should hinder me from having my own way. Yet, though I prattle on with other men, in my heart his roots twine everywhere." Her fantastic excitement and tantalizing confidences wrought Wandsworth to great curiosity, but he dared ask no questions. At a gateway in the lofty arch of limestone, she fitted her master key in the lock. "'Tis the nearest way," she said, "though there is no boundary betwixt the garden and the moor on the eastern side. Were it not night time and over cold, we would loiter here, and you should tell me of life in town. Ay, me, Steve has not let me leave this prison for 2 dreary 12 months. None but country joskins to talk folly with, an overflow of my love to fall on such silly creatures as Crystalla and old Lightfoot." Ere they had passed halfway up the broad path, the valves of a great door swung inward, and a man appeared on the topmost stone of a staircase that descended to a terrace. To Wandsworth's bewilderment, he was attired as quaintly as the lady, in black satin coat and knee breeches, and vest of embroidered green. A white periwig covered his head, in peculiar contrast with the jetty curved eyebrows. His sparkling eyes were of a hue to match. The corners of his mouth were drawn upward, uncovering small white teeth. Despite the malevolence of his expression, it was impossible to deny that his beauty was equal to the lady's. She caught Wandsworth's sleeve and drew him forward. "Steve," she said in a voice that quavered perceptibly, "in my journey for the Fawn's safety I come across a wayfarer, poor gentleman, who had taken shelter in Nor's hut, and knowing that you delight in showing hospitality to all, I brought him here." Her husband lifted his forefinger to his brow, as if to smooth out a gathering frown, then, giving Wandsworth a cordial welcome, led the way to the hearth of a dining parlour. "I am vastly wearied of the folk I know," he said, "and 'tis indeed a pleasure to see a stranger in this house. For my wife's sake," the lady gave a little cry of surprise, "I live here and make best of it. This is her inheritance, remote from the world of gaiety. I warrant Sophia loves the seclusion." "Bah!" she exclaimed, "I do not love it. I shall never love a jailhouse, though I may love my keeper." She flung off her mantle and glided across the room to an open spinet. Still standing, she used her right hand to draw out a few chords, then sang the first words of Phillida Flouts Me. "Oh, what a plague is love, I cannot bear it. She will inconstant prove, I greatly fear it." Wandsworth, glancing at his host, saw in his countenance a look of agonizing pain that changed instantly into an agreeable smile. The wife left her spinet and went to an oaken buffet that bore, amongst bright pewterware, a stone flask and a silver loving cup. She drew out the stopper of the former, filled the vessel to the brim, then drank lightly. "Here's to a happy meeting," she said. "Here's to a joyful break in our dullness." She passed it to Wandsworth, touching meaningly that part of the edge which her lips had pressed. Stephen Marlowe's back was turned for the nonce, and the young man, unaware that he faced a mirror, nodded and drank, ending with an audible kiss, at sound of which the husband swung round suddenly upon his heel. Sophia thereupon made a demure curtsy, her hands clasped over her bosom, where the velvet met the frilled muslin of her chemisette. "Alack and well a day," she sang, "she loves me to gainsay." Stephen strode forward and caught her by the wrist. "Damn you," he muttered huskily. "You have met this man before." "And if I have, what then?" she responded. "Surely I met men before I met you. At the court, indeed, I knew gentlemen, ere I was fool enough to listen to your prayers. I command you to release my hand. I have no liking for purple bracelets made by your iron fingers." "My God," he groaned, as he thrust her roughly aside. "You go too far, Sophie, to speak thus in a stranger's presence." Then, without waiting for her reply, he averted his face and abruptly left the chamber. She sighed wearily, motioned Wormsworth to rest by the fire, and putting down her rebellious hoop, she sank into the recesses of a heavy, gilt-framed, brocade-covered armchair. "Alas," she said, almost whimpering, "it is very hard to live with such a housemate. Had I known that Marlowe would use me thus, I would have stopped my ears with wax, as Ulysses did when the siren chanted. A bell, the most famous toast of 3 years agone, to be kept barred in a cage, to be slighted affront a foreigner. See, his violence hath already marked my poor skin. There's 5 scarlet spots growing darker every instant." She held out her hand. Wormsworth knelt and drew it nearer the firelight. Curiously enough, the quaintness of the manners reflected itself upon him. He began unconsciously to mimic demeanour and speech. "Prithee, Mistress Sophia," he said, "do not blame me, though I be the cause." Her merry laugh rang out again. Perhaps that was why the tapestry curtain of another doorway, opposite to that by which they had entered, fluttered convulsively. "Not mistress," she cried, "Lady Sophia, Sophie to my friends and to my jealous husband, a marquis's daughter, wedded to a commoner. Ah, I do not blame you, sir. I ask but a penance, each stain to be kissed. A kiss is the best salve in the world." A low moan came from behind the tremulous curtain as the young man's lips touched the warm, satiny skin. Doubtless Lady Sophia heard it, for the light in her eyes danced very fantastically, and she stooped until her face was very near his own. "Hist!" she whispered. "Let you and me play a comedy, such as Mr. Wycherley wrote ages ago. I'll do the talking. Your part is but to smile and languish and say aye every time I pause. Now for it. The curtain rises." Her voice rose as she began to speak in tones brimful of feigned tenderness and delight. "Ah, Sir Michael, to think that tonight we should meet so unexpectedly, when tomorrow, by assignation at the Druid Circle, which I described in my summons, you were to wait my coming, while Steve was a-hunting the fox. He never knew of your existence, by Gemini. He never shall know what passed between us. There's an infinitely keener joy in stolen kisses, such as you wot of in Nor's hut." "Aye," said Wormsworth, "aye. Dost remember at my aunt's ball, the Bath Assembly Rooms, the place, after young Mr. Beckford had led me through the minuet, you fumed and fretted, foolish boy, and swore that you would spit him on your rapier. There was budding down on your upper lip then, and your skin was fair as mine. And to appease you, dearest, I promised to wed you some day, but sure I was not in earnest. Why, heart o' me, I was scarce 16 at the time, and you were but 3 months older. When your folks sent you on the grand tour, we both wept like bantlings." She linked her arm round his neck, hollowed her palm to support his chin, and turned his face upwards. A rebellious fever heated his veins. He would have given much for her words to have been sober truth. "Why play comedy any longer?" he murmured hoarsely. "Nay, you'll spoil my pretty mischievous plot," she whispered in return. "Be your old self, Sir Michael," she cried. "Steve hath no inkling of whom you are, or how we loved, and still love." "Aye," he said. "I vow," she continued, "that you're as goodly to look upon as you were 8 years ago. Many and many a night have I awoke in my bed thinking that no comelier man has ever created since the days of Adam. We were made for each other. There's conceit for you. Can you say in earnest that I am still as beautiful as in those days when you called me your little wife, when we broke asunder a silver ring?" Lovelier, said Warmsworth with an enthusiasm that was not pretended. Infinitely lovelier. Her cheek was pressed against his. Her breath stirred the tiny curls on his temples. Had I known that time would work no change in your affections, she said, I would never have hearkened to Steve's protestations. But he swore to kill himself if I said him nay. He followed me like a spaniel, battered at my door till in very hopelessness I let him enter. And you were flaunting abroad with your tutor, loving the maids of Italy and France and Allemagne, whilst I had naught of you save a broken bit of silver. She drew hereby to her full height and stood apart, casting a mischievous look at the further doorway. Warmsworth rose from his knees and confronted her, his eyes bright as hers and as vivid a colour as in his cheeks. Steve is far away, she said, working off his fury in a flight over the moor. He has never learned, shall never learn, what is hidden in the trinket I keep against my heart. Her fingers began to toy with the laces of her bosom. For I kept it sacred to you, and swore no other man should e'er open it. Warmsworth no longer remembered his injunction to say naught but I. He moved nearer. She retreated a step. Let me see it, he cried. The coquette laughed for the last time, and thrust out her arms as if to fend his touch. Nay, she said, with my own will I'll ne'er show it. She plucked from her bodice a loop of sky-blue ribbon. You shall not make me do what I would not. He came nearer still, and clutching the ribbon strove to draw the locket from its nest. Of a sudden she grew white and faint, reeling back against her chair. The comedy is played, she faltered. Marlowe strode forward, tearing the tapestry from its hooks. So fearful was he to behold that Warmsworth shrank aside, as if in grim earnest the man was possessed with a demon. Sophia strove to regain her composure, and grasping one of his clenched fists, essayed to relax its tension. My dearest, she stammered piteously, 'twas but a piece of acting. I ne'er saw the man before tonight, and I knew that you were present all the time. I saw the curtain shake. I heard you gasp and groan. Then she quailed in silence before the madness she had evoked. Warmsworth laid his hand upon the lappet of Marlowe's coat. The lady speaks the truth, man, he cried. But Marlowe, paying no heed to his words, pointed to the door by which they had entered, and his wife crept from the chamber, with him following stealthily in her wake. The door slammed, and Warmsworth heard the turning of a key. He beat upon the panels, but nobody came. He hastened to the other door to find it barred with an invisible spring. Beyond the heavily mullioned oriel window a faint ray of moonlight showed him two mist-cloaked figures, one in pursuit of the other, scurrying over the snow-covered garden. He began to pace restlessly to and fro, ever and anon striking the door and the floor in the vain hope of summoning some servant. At last, wearied with over-excitement, he flung himself in a chair by the sinking fire, and fell into an uneasy slumber, from which, after curious dreams of mingled joy and horror, he was awakened by the creaking of rusty hinges. His eyes were dull and heavy. Some moments passed before he recognized old Barton, the keeper who stood at his side. Instead of the panelled walls of Marlowe's dining parlour, he saw piled clods, with chinks that admitted a dim daylight. "How did I come here?" he inquired in a voice that sounded peculiarly rasping. "Lord have mercy, sir," said the relieved gaffer. "You've been lost on the moor, on a neat when no folk of these parts'll dare to venture out. It's 10 o'clock. At dawn I took the cob and started a-seeking you. You'd be grey as death." "Have you a flask?" said Warmsworth. "I feel cramped and sick." He drank and rose from the bracken. At the door stood a grey pony, which Barton helped him to mount. Neither spoke as they moved slowly through the rain, until they came to some rough piles of stone, where Barton, who was a good Catholic, crossed himself devoutly. "There's Offerton Old Hall," he remarked in a low voice. "At least, there it stood. It's been in ruins for more nor 100 year, sin' Mr. Marlowe drowned his lady in the marsh, through jealousy." And that's the end of that one. And I'm briefly going to stand up and let Joey out the room. 1 second. I'm back, and with sincere apologies for the dodgy accents. It wouldn't be my choice. I was that was Joey going out of the room. Yes. He came in. He was on me for a bit. Then he was on the bed, and then he wished to leave. Such is the life of a cat. He'll be back in about 5 minutes. But yes, I apologise that. Well, basically, Gilchrist wrote these people with an accent. It's like he's done the thing of. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Joey Command would be good. Yeah, done the thing that authors will do of. Oh, a command for apologising for accents. Yes, maybe that too. I don't know English accents enough to know it's dodgy. Well, I mean, the excuse is that every character was born and raised and spent most of their life in middle-class Oxfordshire, and then moved to places that have a more distinct northern regional accent, and are just trying to fit in. Basically, yeah, Gilchrist wrote these characters with some accent, and I'm not entirely certain which, but it's there. And you can't just kind of duck in and out of it as the words dictate. So I figured I'm just gonna. It feels, because it's set Peak District, like there's just something generically northern, and so I've attempted to do my best northern accent for them, which I've probably screwed up, and I do apologise. I'm not trying to make fun of the accent. I'm just trying to follow what the story says. But yes, that was the first one. That was thingy. That was not The Return. That was what I read last time. A Night on the Moor. Yeah, the one northern accent that I can do. But yeah, that was A Night on the Moor, and I shall do another one in a second. But I'm just finishing my tea. And yeah, when I first read that, I'd initially kind of dismissed it a little bit as like, oh, okay, so it's just a guy who wanders in on a bit of spousal abuse, great, and then finds out that they were dead and ghosts. But in the editor's summary of it, they mention that it's is our protagonist's presence kind of the instigating factor for the abuse? Like, has he somehow fallen through some kind of hole in time and encounters these figures and is kind of the catalyst for the fateful incident that it's, and I know that's a more interesting premise to me. Victorians really liked that, and they were ghosts the entire time, so it's yes. And that's sort of what I thought this was at first, like, oh, this is just a man seeing ghosts. But yeah, it's like he seems to be a contributing factor in the murder as described at the end, which to me is more interesting, because it's like, So I found that like a bit of a more interesting bit of meat on the story bones there. Strong analogy, that. But yeah, that was A Night on the Moor, and I shall now move on to the next story which I picked out. Unless he was filling a role somehow. How do you mean? Yeah, Storybone Broth. Lovely. Yeah, it's sort of like the kind of recursive time loop thing of, would this have happened? Like, yeah, was it Warmsworth? Was Warmsworth like just an observer, or was he actually a contributing factor? And had he not been out on the moor to kind of participate in this, would this scene have played out? Probably inevitably. It sounds like a pretty violent, toxic relationship anyway, but yeah. As in, there was someone else who visited when they weren't ghosts, and someone managed to be there playing out. Oh, right, yeah, was he just like witnessing it from the perspective of someone else who was there at the time? Or, yeah, was he actually present in this scene back when it happened to set it up and make it happen? That sort of thing. And yeah, that to me is some interesting material, I guess. I'm at a loss for words. but good thing I've got a bunch of them in front of me. So I shall now read the next story that I picked out for tonight, which is The Pageant of Ghosts. A late twilight in June. A woodlark rippling in mid-air. Drowsy-scented ladies' bed straw in a marsh that was once a garden. On the terrace wall, beside the cedar, a stone urn with a lambent flame. The casement hung open, and the excess of beauty and perfume drugged me, so that, with a sigh, I sank back into a moth-eaten sedan that had borne 4 generations to court. Dried dust of lavender and rue filtered through the brocade lining, and grew into a mist, wherethrough the bird's song waxed fainter and fainter. Indeed, I was just closing my eyes when the tuning of fifes and viols roused me with a start. A shrill titter from the further end of the ballroom drew me from my seat, and the outer extremity of the oriel hung a curtain. So at the outer extremity of the oriel hung a curtain of philomot velvet, lined inwardly with pale green silk. Behind this I stole, and, passing the draperies from the wall, gazed towards the musicians' gallery. 5 men, dressed in styles that ranged from the trunk hose and collared mantle of Elizabeth's day to the pantaloons and muslin cravats of the 3rd George, were arranging yellow music sheets on the table. The youngest forced a harsh note from his viol, then struck another's bald pate, and set all a-laughing. A grave silence followed. Then began just such a curious melody as the wind makes in the wood of half-blighted firs. All the sconces were lighted of a sudden, and the martlets and serpents in the alt-relief above the panelling sprang into a weird life. Resting between the fire-dogs on the open hearth were 3 logs, one of pine, another of oak, and a third of sycamore. The grey flame licked them hungrily, and the sap hissed and bubbled. The carved work of the walls was distinct. Potiphar's wife wrapped her bedgown about Joseph. Judith triumphed with the bloody head aloft, and in the centre Lot's daughters paddled with his withered jowls. I felt but little wonder at the change from stillness to life. As the last of my race, treasurer of a vast hoard of traditions, why should I be disturbed by this return of the creatures of old? I dragged forth the creaking sedan and sat waiting. A rusty, half-unstrung zither that hung near quivered and gave one faint note to the melody. Ere its vibration had ceased, Mistress Lenore entered through the arched doorway. Hour after hour had she plucked those wires that cried out in welcome. Her fox-coloured tresses were wrought into a fantastic web, each separate hair twisted and coiled. A pink flush painted her cheeks, and her lustrous blue eyes were mirthful. She wore opals, unfortunate stones for such as love, and hanging from a black riband below her throat was the golden cross Prince Charles had sent her from Rome. The legends of her character came in floods. Wantonly capricious at one moment, earnest and devout as a nun's at another, her expression changed 1,000 times as I beheld. Now she was racking her soul with jealousy, now pleading, as she alone could plead, for pardon, now, when pardon was won, laughingly swearing that her repentance was only feigned. As she neared, my heart beat furiously, and I cried, "Lenore! Lenore!" My voice was low and broken. The music gave a loud burst then, but she passed without a word, her ivory-like hands almost hidden beneath jewels and lace. The further door stood open, and she disappeared. Noel, the platonist, followed, a haggard, middle-aged man in a long cloak of sable-edged black velvet. Forgetful of all save desire, he bore a scroll of parchment, whereon was written in great letters, "To Parthenia." This was the only outcome of his one passion. At the second window he paused, with a wry mouth, to gaze on the statue of Europa from whose arm he had hanged himself. Then his hands were uplifted to his head to force away the agony of despair. For hurrying towards him came the mad maid, who could not love him, being devoted to the memory of one wrecked at sea. "Why art thou in anguish?" she said. "See my joy. Laugh with me. Dance with me. He returns tomorrow. The boat's coming in. Ah, darling, our heart's delight!" And she held up her arms to a girandole, whose candles fluttered. But her face grew long and thin and pale, and she rested on a settee and drew from her pockets a dusky lace veil, which, being unfolded, discovered a ring with a burning topaz and a heart of silver. She leaned forward, resting her brow in her hands, and talked to the toys in her lap as if they understood. To the veil she said, "No bride's joy blushes shalt thou conceal." To the ring, "Thou last gift of him who died and left me." To the heart, "O heart, thou hast endured, thou art not broken." After a few tears she refolded all, and unbuttoning her bodice took from the bosom a miniature framed with pearls. But, as if afraid lest it should grow cold, she replaced it hurriedly, and seeing that Noel beckoned towards her, glided on, sighing and with downcast looks. Then passed a cavalier in azure silk and snowy ruffled cravat and long plumed cap of estate. He was whistling a song that threw all bachelors into humorous ecstasy. Who he was I know not, unless the courtier who had fought a duel with my Lord Brandreth, and had died in the wood near St. Giles's Well, pressing convulsively in his right hand a dainty glove of Spanish kid. The merry fellow, quoth the legend, who loved the world and all in it, but who was over fond of his own jest. Fidessa, the singer, entered next. She had brought her little gilt harp, and her lips were parted to join harmonies of voice and instrument. Bright yellow hair plaited in bands that formed a filigrane-bound coronet, eyes half-veiled, with sleepy lashes, hands fragile as seashells. It was the Verdi Prati, Mr. Handel's celebrated song, that she adored most, and on the morrow she would sing it at Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre. At least, she proposed to sing it then and there. Fate, however, had otherwise ordained. The tomorrow would never come, and the sweetheart at the Upland Grange might well write on her letters, "Darkness hath overcome me." Thin and pale Margot, her wanness heightened by dishevelled black curls, came forward in her scarlet cloak. Silent reproach was in her every feature. Her eyes were stern and long-suffering. The prophecy that bound up her life with that of her dying twin was rapidly approaching consummation. Another moment and the direst pain filled her, for a loud cry from an outer chamber told her he was dead. As she disappeared in the gloom, Nabob Darrington, himself in life the lover of a ghost, paced slowly along. A beau of the last century, wearing a satin-flowered waistcoat and a coat and breeches of plum-coloured kerseymere. Between his finger and thumb he held the diamond which he had brought from the East as a spousal gift to the woman who, unknown to him, had died of waiting. He was anticipating the meeting with her, and his brown cheeks flushed blood-red at the sound of a light footstep. He turned, saw one with violet eyes and tragic forehead, and with one joyous murmur they enfolded each other and passed. Althea approached, a massive creature gowned in white and gold. In one hand she held a tangle of sops in wine, and the other, as symbolical kings hold globes, a bejewelled missal. The contention between the two lovers, the old, who had tyrannized until her life was of the saddest, and the new, who filled her with such wild happiness, was troubling her, and she was pondering as to which should gain the victory. She was just beginning to understand that to wait in passive indecision is to be torn with dragon's teeth. Barbara, with eyes like moon-pierced amethysts, followed, singing Ben Jonson's Robin Goodfellow, in a sweet quaver that was only just heard above the music. How strangely her looks changed, from maiden innocence to the awakening of love, from the height of passion to the abyss of despair. But as she went, the horizon was ripped from end to end, and a golden arrow leaps into the ballroom. Dawn had broken. The scent of ladies' bed straw was trebly strong. The tired woodlark sank lower and lower. The room was empty. The pageant had passed and done. And that brings us to the end of that story. And I think where I should probably take my first break for the evening, probably the only break. I'm not planning on going for extra long. Yeah, I hear Joey at the door, so I'm going to go to a break and see you back in a few minutes. If I can find the right shortcut on the thing. See you in a bit. hit the right shortcut. Hooray for me. That's good news. It means I'm learning just in time for swapping over to a new laptop after this and having to learn it all over again. But that's a bridge to cross another day. But yeah, welcome back. I hope and trust that you have had a worthwhile and productive break, as I. Realise I forgot to say hello and goodbye to Sil for showing up earlier, but hello, good to see you. I understand that you were doing better, which is good news. I'm glad to hear it. You know, for when you're watching the VOD. Yeah, I after talking earlier about how I tend to just make one Russian caravan tea and then call it done for the day, I thought I would indulge myself in a second one, so I have that, which is currently steeping on the desk. But yeah, I hope you listening at home have been enjoying things so far and having a good time. I have a couple more stories that I intend to read, and we'll see how I go. I think they're both fairly short ones. Beautiful. Thank you, Budon. That's how I'm pronouncing that. More tea is good tea, yes. Yeah, I'm fine with this decision that I have made. Yeah, I've got, I think, 2 more that I had planned, and if I get through them, I might go back and redo the other one that I did the other week and ended up getting cut short. Yeah, because these look pretty short, so I'll probably get through these pretty quick. But yeah, if we're all back and gathered and ready and settled, I guess I might as well. Hey, Salad! Hello, welcome. Just in time before I start reading, and then I would have to just ignore you rolling in like that. You'll be pleased to know we are doing more Gilchrist, and hopefully this time my internet. Oh, I do have 121 dropped frames, 0.1%. Okay, but currently that's better than last time. But yeah, we're doing more Gilchrist, and I've not yet gone back to do the one that was interrupted last time. Maybe I'll, if I leave myself some time, get to that. But I'm really hungry this evening, so I don't want to run over too far. But yeah, good to see you here. Glad you're here. Hope you're well. And I guess I shall roll on with the next story. If I don't, yeah, Joey's not in the room currently. He wanted to come in. And then when I opened the door, he's in a silly mood and spooked and ran off. So he'll be back, no doubt, and I will have to interrupt myself to let him in. Just got home from internship, very happy you can finally sit. Oh, nice. Oh, I hope that's going well. And yes, glad that you are back and able to sit, and glad that you have chosen here to do that. Yeah, anything else? I'm trying to think what content warnings are relevant for these ones. Just quickly skimming through. I mean, again, I guess the usual gothic ghost fiction. Yeah, let's just go with those same ones. Yeah, content warnings of like domestic abuse, self-harm, baby loss kind of stuff. Not exactly cheery subjects and stuff to advise people of before we get into them, just in case that's something that's a bit too far. Which is completely fine and valid. It's very fun with someone to start it. Glad you can ride a pair of hands. Nice. Yeah, all good. But yeah, I'm going to get on with some stories and hope that you have a comfy place to sit, a tea to hand, as I crack on. This is The Priest's Pavern by R.Murray Gilchrist. Yesternight I took my vial and made my way over the limestone cliffs to the concave where stand the ruins of Woodsetts, the house Vignola, who was designed St. Angelo's castle in Rome, he who designed St. Angelo's castle in Rome had built beside the fallen abbey for his boon fellow Bateman de Colt. And as I sat, drawing the strings together, nigh the pedestal of the goddess of plenty in the white summer house, behold, The overgrown yew and privet bushes that had once been clipped in forms of dragon and hippogriff shrank again to their old preciseness, and the terminal statues rose from the grass, and the wreathed columns bore again their garment of midsummer roses. I played the priest's pavan that I had learned from the Book of Airs, and at the first note the fire-stains on the frontispiece vanished, and one by one the gaping windows donned their lattices, and the leaden roof shone above the parapet, and the light of 1,000 sconces fell about me in broken rillocks of gold. It was no longer the burr of my viol that rang in my ears, but the chirping of a virginals in music that was conceived by a divinity. One noontide, more than 10 years ago, my lord came to the town and found me by the table in my chamber, copying in fair hand the suite of dances that I had made for Daphne's wedding. His tumid red face shone unctuously, his attire was disordered with the heat. He flung a parchment book upon the table and laughed, as he ever laughed, like one drunk with wine. "Till the morning, when they took up a stone that had cracked in the monk's chapel," said he, "my steward found this in a brazen casket. A set of dances such as are not used nowadays, of music far superior to aught such crickets as you create." I could not demur, for my lord was a cognoscento, and although he oft times affected liking for my work, and professed to find genius therein, I knew that 'twas but humble in his regard. His life had been spent in the great world. Players and singers had been damned by his frown. So I took up the book, and opening its pages saw quaintly shaped notes ranged up and down like little coffins draped in scarlet and black. "'Tis in lute tabulation," I said, "a book of the heirs ecclesiastics loved ere the Reformation brought them low." "Ay," commented my lord, "mayhap the work of the white monk who haunts the precincts o' nights. Him the humble folk call Ambrose." The very sight of that page evokes pictures of woodmen's wives, oddly gowned, hay-tricks come-a-go-trixing, in the cloisters. But farewell to this light talk. Madam, when I put it in her hand, she hath a rage for antiquities, sat her down to the harpsichord, and played things that drove away the scene before our eyes, and set us a-wandering in strange places. She fell a-longing, and by her whim all the plans for music at our little mistress's nuptials are changed. That which you have done shall be brought to light when the lass gives her master a fine boy. Her mother hath sworn to revive all the dances. See, here at the end is a description, and our guests are being taught galliards, lavoltas, pavans. What I have come to tell is that naught will content her save that the musicians, receiving their due pay, be disbanded, and that you alone will sit in the gallery and tinkle an ancient virginals from sunset to midnight, whilst we, poor fools, hop and scurry like grigs." My heart was burdened with disappointment, but I held my peace. Daphne had been my pupil. I had taught her rosy fingers to dash like fire-drakes over the keys, to draw softer notes than the wood-doves. I had not seen the bridegroom. The match was made at court, or perchance the excellence of my music might have been marred. As it was, I had thrown into each chord a speech of my devotion to the maid. She had ever known that I regarded her with great tenderness, and, being endowed, despite her green youth, with a keener insight than her fellows, had twined wreaths of laurel for my grey head, and made my chamber ever bright with flowers. The knowledge that he whom her parents had chosen was a man of advanced years and more than evil fame had distressed me for the while, but the child, from her very innocence, had hitherto displayed no distaste when she spoke of the future. My lord gave me a folded paper. "Madam hath writ here the order of the dances," he said. "There is but short time for you to study. Since the wedding day being Thursday, the book must be returned to her on the morrow. The priest's pavan is the last. 'Tis the wildest thing in the world, all strutting and curtsying and twisting the arms and pointing downwards with the thumbs. And Anne, master fiddler, I must leave you, for my son-in-law waits below, too gouty to climb your stairs. Be sure no harm comes to the book, for if I may believe madam, it has worth above rubies. He descended, panting, to his chariot. Peering from my casement, I saw, beside the opened panel, the face of the bridegroom, wrinkled, yellow and unholy, with the dull eyes that only sparkle at the sight of the table or of a woman's loveliness. His lace cravat hung beneath his chin like the beard of an African ape. He poked his fingers betwixt my lord's ribs and cackled foolishly. "'Tis a wench you keep there," he cried. "To the deuce with your talk of music, men. A sweet morsel, red and creamy as Temple's nectarines, and with hair soft and light as tow. Send for her down, so that I may look on your choice. A minx, I vow. Madam shall know." I heard no more, for the stone horses leaped forward, and the chariot lurched away towards the marketplace, where the fresh huckster wenches from the uplands stood beside their stores. When the by-street was quiet again, I passed to my harpsichord and played the music of the Book of Airs from end to end, finding at the very first that a masterpiece of either good or evil genius lay before me on the stand. 1 second. I may have to contend with a cat. Never before had I dreamed of melody so exquisitely pleasurable, so bitterly painful. In each were two things: the flitting of white angels over the lawns of heaven, and the dancing of fiends around the tormenting fires of hell. The fragrance of ever-blooming flowers and the stench of brimstone hovered about in ghostly clouds. I heard the laughter of pure children and the cachinnations of imps. Ere long, half my chamber was filled with a radiance infinitely brighter than the dying sun's. The other half was lost in impenetrable blackness. My body was sick and trembling, but my spirit was full of eager delight. At the priest's pavern, I was overcome with frenzy and with ecstasy. This told of the war between heaven and hell, of the clashing of archangels' lances, of devils rushing forward and falling back, of breaches made in golden ramparts, of Apollyon leading his myrmidons almost to the battlements, but the voice of God was lifted in thunder, and hell with its warriors sank seething together through chaos. My fingers curled like the talons of a bird. My head sank till my chin lay upon my breast. This was no budget of dances, no toy to please Madam the Countess withal, but an epic of divinity. Perchance it had passed from generation to generation of churchmen, as our Bible in later years had passed to us. 'Twas music such as I heard at the triumphal feasts of cherubim. "I will not play it," I said. "Although I lose my lord's favour, I'll be no party to profanity. 'Tis not meet that such a group about the court should caper to its passion." In the night time, as I lay sleepless, the parchment shone like touchwood. I rose, hid it in a coffer, yet still I knew of its glittering, and the obsession remained. At dawn I enclosed it in my leathern wallet, and prepared to start for Woodsetts. But on the threshold I was met by Daphne, hooded, so that until she had unknotted the throat-strings none might have known her for the bride. "The women rose betimes to gather midsummer dew," she said, "and I stole apart and ran, so that I might bid my master farewell, and tell him how that I shall ever pray for his fame." The maid was pale as death. Her eyes were red with restlessness and weeping. I drew her into the chamber, and there, as she had still the ways of a child, she sat upon my knee and passed her fingers through my hair and kissed my forehead. "'Tis a long farewell," she whispered. "Who knows that I may ever return? I have fear at times that my life must shortly reach its term. I would fain have you think of me sometimes." "I am old and withered, Mistress Daphne," I made answer, "and there is no hope of fame for old men. But as long as I have breath, you shall lie in the innermost cabinet." Big tears rolled down her cheeks. "Ah, master," she sighed, 'Tis hard to go away from the folk here to a strange country with one I understand nothing of, and to know that he will be with me always. My mother tells me to have no fear, for my husband will hold me as the apple of his eye. Alack, to be without young playmates." She dried her face with her kerchief and rose. Her glance fell on the book in the wallet. "Will you not play to me of that music?" she said. "Tomorrow night all dance to it. We are being instructed in the oddest steps." I shook my head. "Nay, little one, you must never hear it. This morning I take it back to your lady mother with word that I cannot follow her behest." Daphne sank to her knees and clasped my neck. "Then play it to me but once," she pleaded. "I was ever an apt learner, and it may be that I shall understand. When I heard before, out of the harshness came a curious joy, but you will turn each note into a strung jewel." I gave her no naysay, but moved to the harpsichord and played. And beneath me at first I heard a sound of moaning, then of breath leaping after breath. But when I came to the priest's pavern, Daphne was silent as the grave. I turned to find her standing erect, with rapt countenance, her hands clasped over burgeoning breasts. A while passed ere she spoke. Her voice came low and trembling. "'Tis my desire, master, that you play thus at my nuptials." And she left the chamber with no other word. So it was that on the appointed night I sat alone in the musicians' gallery of the ballroom at Woodsetts. This place had in long past times been the refectory of the monks, and the master builder, Vignola, had chosen that, save for the new floor of oak that swung on iron chains, all should remain unaltered. Behind the tapestries of the Gobelins, which my lord's father had purchased, still might be found dim wall pictures of Christ at Gethsemane, of the Virgin, and of the Apostles. The light of the candles showed the company from the court, all bedizened with trinkets and plumes of brocades, moving to and fro in clusters. Madame came secretly up the narrow staircase and beckoned me into the shadow, not deeming it fit that the wedding guests should see her converse with one so inferior. The lines of her forehead were eloquent of caprice and satisfaction. "No chance had I to speak with you before," she said. "The whirl of this merry day hath held me every moment. What think you of the bride? Almost a woman now, tomorrow on the way to matronhood." Looking down, I saw Daphne, quivering affrightedly, like a white culver amongst ravens. At hand sauntered the groom, simpering, whispering to the menfolk behind screening fingers. "I know not what to think," I said. Madame gave no heed. Impatient for the signal of withdrawal, I protest. "See how restlessly she stirs. But, master, what of the music? What of my plan of giving life again to these ancient dances? 'Tis vastly taking. Duchess Mary, she who wears the sombre gown with yellow leaves, declares that her recollection tells that not according to the teaching of the book were galliards and lavoltas danced. They say her age exceeds the century. The beldam dotes, but, even if she be right, why, 'tis a fine thing to dance in styles past human memory. And even if, as she fears, they be enchanted dances, 'tis so much the better. It may be that ghosts will rise." Whereat she made her mocking curtsy and withdrew, and anon I began the first air, and the floor swayed under mad caprioles. And in the pause I looked downward again, and saw that each face save Daphne's had grown wan and pregnant with unutterable wickedness. But the maid was blushing, as if the breeze of April clipped her cheeks. She had stolen apart from the rest, and, bride though she was, all were so intent upon their performance that she passed unobserved. Methought, as dance followed dance, a thin, sulphury vapour rose and wrapped about these revellers, so that their bodies grew vague, and little was to be seen but their lustful blinking eyes. Still Daphne stood alone, and neglected, toying with the rose at her girdle. The voice of the virginals swelled so that all other sound was hidden. The mist grew ever thicker and thicker. Ere the playing of the priest Pavan, it seemed as if horny wings had risen from the shoulders of each dancer, and the skin of each had swarthened under the powder. Then, to the first notes were made the magic twists and down-turnings of the thumbs, and of a sudden, with one accord, the dancers ceased all movement, and my hands fell numbed. For the tapestry of the eastern wall was drawn aside, and one, clothed as a priest in shining vestments, entered through an arched doorway, and moved to the place where Daphne waited. A hallowed light emanated from his face and hands, so that none might see. As he approached the maid, this radiance wound about her in tender embrace. She showed no sign of blenching, but sank before him as the Magdalene sank before Christ. He raised her with infinite gentleness, and put his arm about her waist, and led her to the place whence he had come. There followed no murmur of anger or surprise, but as I gazed, smoke and tongues of fire leaped from every crevice on the floor, and, in another minute, there came the noise of iron chains snapping. Then, as flames leaped to lick the roof, one hoarse wail of agony. And that's the end of that story. So, you like stories about spooky music and haunted dances? Because that's what you got in The Priest's Pavan. Hope you enjoyed that. And what is the time? 10:30? Cool. Then I guess I might as well just roll straight into the next one. Love you some haunted art? Heck yeah, haunted art's great. Yeah, the next story, and possibly the last one, it's pretty short. I don't know, we'll see. I don't have another one that I've not read picked out and pre-read for tonight, so I'm kind of reluctant to do that, but I might go back and do, not to nitpick, but it's pronounced Pavan. I'd wondered if it was that, but I did also, because I was planning to read this last time, 2 weeks ago, and I did look online and found a pronunciation guide that said it's pronounced Pavan. So, do I trust the internet, or do I trust the classical musician that knows that it's pronounced Pavan? I was wondering whether it's like a sort of a commoner thing, whether Pavan is how it probably would be pronounced by these people in this time, and Pavan might actually be the nicer, kind of fancier, proper pronunciation of it. I don't know. That was my guess. But I'm saying it Pavan because that's what I want to say. You've never heard it pronounced Pavan? You have now. Boom. Roasted. Got him. Completely zoned out while listening, which is an uncommon thing for you because your brain usually works 24/7. Thoroughly enjoying it. Hey, nice, Buddha. Well, I'm happy to help you switch off. And possibly switching off and just going on autopilot while I'm reading the story about the spooky haunted music and dance. It's just a type of dance and isn't English, so it might all be an anglicised version. Yeah, I don't know. I'm to be clear, I'm 100% not arguing with you. You have encountered the word and know it much better than me. So, yeah. But yes, anyway, on to what may be the last story for tonight. This is Dame Innoslad. Sycamores and beeches surrounded the inn. Elders, still green-flowered, leaned over the grass-grown roads. The belt of swards was white with lady smocks, but in the damp hollows marsh marigolds radiated essential sunlight. The blackbirds sang, and loudly, yet without the true strain of mirth, sang like blackbirds that must sing, but of rifled nests. Even the grasshoppers had some trouble. Never had they chirped so pathetically before. On the green, the gilded figure of a bull hung from two uprights. It swung from side to side in the light breeze. The copper bell on a twisted pole hard by was green with mould. A swing from it was a rusty chain. It had been used in the old posting days, and many a yeoman had haled himself into his saddle from the worn mounting block beside it. For the inn itself, it was vast and rambling, dwarfed by the towering trees. For miles in every direction lay the old forest of Gardenwood, a relic of primeval woodland, rich in glades and brakes, in streamlets and mizzies, hazy in clearings where sheer legs, like the trivets of witches' cauldrons, and tents and blue smoking heaps told of charcoal burners and their ever-shifting trade. The Golden Bull, with its beautiful precincts, took me back to that fading Arcady, whose shepherdesses and swains felt the end of the joy time coming. It was utterly sad, but I was caught in the meshes of its melancholy, and for the while could not escape. Twilight fell, and I ceased from exploring, and went indoors. In the parlour was a great square piano. Its music, while acidly discordant, was yet plaintive with the curious speech such old things often own. I played a few Robin Hood ballads, of the outlaw and Little John, of the Bishop of Hereford and Robin's pleasing escape. Then the hostess entered with a great Nottingham jar full of white lilac. She set this down between the fire dogs, and stood leaning one hand on a chair back and listening to the music. When I stopped, she sighed heavily. I left the piano and offered her a chair. She was middle-aged and deformed. Her shoulders were humped, her face was shriveled, but she had large grey eyes and a wistful smile. "Thank you, sir," she said. "'Twas the music drew me in. Nobody's played since last summer, when Sir Jake Innoslad stayed here. His taste was sonatas and fugues, things pretty enow, but only pleasing at the time. Give me a melody that I can catch, almost grasp in my hand, so to speak." "Do you play?" I asked, half hoping to hear some air she had loved in her youth. "No, I cannot play. I was still room maid at the Melbrook Abbey, so I never had opportunity." As she spoke, a girl came in with the snuffer tray and candles. She was pale and tall and of a tempting shape. Beautiful she was not, and yet the sad strangeness of her face impressed me more than great beauty would have done. Her eyes were like the other woman's, but clearer and more expressive. Her lips were quaintly arched. Her long yellow hair hung down her back. She seemed, although she walked erect, to be recovering from some violent illness. When she had gone, the hostess spoke again. "My niece is not strong," she said, laying an unnecessary emphasis on the word niece. "The air does not suit her." "Was she not bred in the country?" I inquired. No. She is not without money. Her father endowed her well. Until 2 years back she was at the convent of the Sisters of Saint Vincent de Paul for her education. 'Tis in the hill country, and I think that coming to the flatness of Gardenwood has done her harm." The girl came in again. This time I noted her grace of movement. It had something of the wearied goddess. "Aunt," she said quietly, "I wish to go into the woods. Can you spare me?" All I had to do was done. The women are sewing in the kitchen. She went to the further end of the room, where a cloak of rose-coloured silk hung, ermine-lined, from a nail in the panelling. She donned it at her leisure. Her long and narrow hands were of a perfect colour. She tied the broad ribbons of the collar. She lighted 2 candles that hung before a tarnished mirror, and gazed at her shadow. Then, her lips moving silently, she left the room. "Ever the same," the old woman said. "Night after night does she leave the house and travel about like an aimless thing. Come back, Dinah," she called. "Come back." But the thin voice went wavering through the empty passages unanswered. So the hostess rose, and with a half-apologetic "good night," left me alone. I sat down in the deep recess of the window behind a heavy curtain. A copy of Denis Diderot's Religieuse lay on the table. I took it up, and was soon engrossed in it. For of all books this is the most fascinating, the most disappointing, the most grim. A light came glimmering at the end of the vista before me. It grew and grew, and the moon uplifted herself waist high above the trees. And when I had watched her thus far, I returned to my nun and reached page 22 of the second volume, where I read the following sentence. After a few flourishes, she played some things, foolish, wild, and incoherent as her own ideas, but through all the defects of her execution, I saw she had a touch infinitely superior to mine. Then, in the shaded window seat, I fell asleep. The striking of a tall clock near the hearth awakened me. I had slept till midnight. The candles had been removed from the table to the piano. Those in the girandole had guttered out or been extinguished. A young man sat at the piano on the embroidered stool. His back was towards me. I saw nothing but high, narrow shoulders and a dome-shaped head of dishevelled black hair, plentifully besprinkled with grey. From the road outside came a noise of horses whinnying and plunging. I looked out, and there was a lumbering coach drawn by 4 stallions, which, black in daylight, shone now like burnished steel. The would-be musician turned and showed me a long, painful face with glistening eyes and a brow ridged upward like a ruined stair. It was a face of intense eagerness, the eagerness of a man experimenting with praying for a result whereon his life depends. Without any prelude, he played a dance of ghosts in an old ballroom, ghosts of men and women that moved in lavoltas and sarabands, ghosts that laughed at Susanna in the tapestry, ghosts that loved and hated. When the last chord had sent them crowding to their graves, he turned and listened for a footstep. None came. He lifted a leather case from the side of the stool and, unfastening its clasps, took out a necklace which glistened in the candlelight like a fairy shower of rain and snow. It was of table diamonds and marguerites, the gems as big as filberts. He spread it across the wires, and after an instant's reflection began to play. The carcanet rattled and jangled as he went. It was an advancing host of cymbal women. When he listened again, great tears oozed from his eyes. He took up the jewel and played a melody, vapid at first, but so subtle in its repetitions that none might doubt its meaning. Thus, and not otherwise, would sound a lyke-wake sung in a worn voice after a night of singing. And whilst he played, the door opened silently, and I saw Dinah, there in her nightgown, holding the posts with her hands. She took one swift glance, then disappeared again in the darkness, and came back, carrying in her arms a bundle swathed in pure linen, and strongly redolent of aromatic herbs. Holding this to her breast, she approached the man. Her shadow fell across the keys, and he lifted his head. From both came a long murmur, his of love and joy and protection, hers of agony. He rose and would have clasped her, but she drew back and placed her burden in his outstretched hands. "It is the child," she said. "3 months ago I gave birth to her. None knew save myself. She was all that remained of you, all that I had, and I dared not part with her. But now that I have seen you again, take her away. Leave me in peace." "Dinah," he said proudly, "listen to me." "Nay," she whispered, "not again. If I listen I may forget your wickedness. I might be weak again. Leave me, Jake." "Dinah, you must hear me. Why, out of all the love you held and hold for me, can you condemn? When I left you I fell mad. For the year I have been mad, and only yesterday did they set me loose. See, I have brought you all the diamonds. Tomorrow you will be Dame Innoslad." And he laid the dead thing on a table, and caught the mother to his bosom. Her figure was shaken with sobs. "Oh," she cried, "it has been hard, but my trial has brought the true guerdon of happiness. Only once have I missed seeing the place where you promised to meet me, the place where you said you loved me, and that was on the night of my lonely travailing. Outside the horses plunged and snorted, a shrunken postilion swaying at the neck of the off-leader. In the hollows of the road lay sheets of mist, and the moonlight turned them into floods. A long train of startled owls left the hollow sycamores and passed hooting down the glade. "Let us go," Sir Jake said. "By morning light we shall be in sight of Camere, where heaven grant us a happy time, a year of joy for each week of pain. Do not wait to dress. Rich robes and linen are inside the coach. I have brought many of my mother's gowns." Dinah extricated herself from his embrace and went to find her cloak. During her absence, a strange and terrible look came into Innoslad's face, and he smote his forehead. He smiled at her, reappearing. "Dinah," he said, looking downwards so that she might not see his eyes, "Dinah, I am so happy that I can scarce see. Lead me from the house." He took up the dead little one in his right arm, and carried it as believers carry relics. The outer door closed softly. They descended the moss-grown steps and entered the coach. The horses leaped forward, half drowning the sound of a chuckle. A glint of the moon perceived the coach windows, and I saw a brown hand, convulsed and violent, gripping a long white throat. And that's the end. Thank you for listening.